Welcome back to History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton. Continuing our discussion of Egypt in the Middle to Late Bronze Ages, we enter into the Second Intermediate Period, still in the Middle Bronze Age, specifically MB2, B through C. Now, beginning this lecture at the second half of the Middle Bronze Age, we discuss the Second Intermediate Period, including talking about the dynastic confusion, outsiders who ruled part of Egypt called the Hyksos, and the collapse of that period. When discussing the New Kingdom, we enter into the Late Bronze Age and talk about a time of innovation and slavery. We also discuss King Akhenaten and the Amarna period, and finally the Ramesside dynasty. Now, because of the chaos that is the intermediate periods, the Second Intermediate Period consists of confusing and overlapping dynasties, including the 14th through the 17th dynasties, where the 17th dynasty is really the only one with a coherent king list. Now, some scholars include at least the late 13th dynasty to this period, and some exclude the 14th dynasty altogether, which really makes no sense to me. Interestingly, it's not only modern histories that become confused at this point. Of note, a king's list from a temple at Abydos dating to the 19th dynasty, Seti I, ignores the kings of both the first and second intermediate periods, and any kings who were considered illegitimate at the time. Now, for the purpose of this study, it will be assumed that the second intermediate period extends from the 13th through the 14th dynasties. Now, it should be pointed out that the Egyptians created something of a canonical past for themselves, as they looked to the past for both authority and authenticity. King Nefertep of the 13th dynasty can be seen in an image piously studying at the House of Writing, attempting to discover how to properly create a statue for Osiris. He wanted to get it right, so he looked to the past. Now, because of this rather canonical nature of the past, those who deviated from the norm, such as during the intermediate periods, were excluded from the canon altogether. At some point during the 13th dynasty, Egypt began to fall apart. Internal collapse occurred with a rapid succession of rulers who attempted but failed to hold the kingdom together. Because of their failure, control of the kingdom fell into multiple regions, causing this overlap of dynasties. The 13th and 17th dynasties ruled in the south, consecutively, and the 14th, 15th, and 16th dynasties all shared power in the Nile Delta, the latter two being foreign rulers. 60 kings of the 13th dynasty continued to rule from Thebes, while simultaneously 75 kings of the 14th dynasty ruled in the Delta. The foreign Hyksos make up both the 15th and 16th dynasties of foreign rulership, while the 17th dynasty is founded at Thebes during the end of the 13th dynasty. Notably, from the earlier periods of the 13th dynasty was found a papyrus that listed the names of 95 slaves, likely belonging to the vizier Rezneb. The greater majority of these names are listed along with the moniker Asiatic. The Asiatics, who began entering the Delta and Eastern Nile banks since the Old Kingdom, who had made their home these regions, began rulership of their own regions in Lower Egypt as the kings of the 13th dynasty just simply couldn't hold power anymore. These Asiatics, peoples from the east of Egypt, are known today as Hyksos, a Greek term derived from the Egyptian meaning princes of foreign countries. The Hyksos were not invaders moving into the land, but rather people from the southern Levant who had moved into Egypt previously, likely seeking reprieve from Levantine famines, carrying Levantine culture with them. Perhaps the most well-known family to have entered Egypt during the Middle Kingdom and remained there throughout the Hyksos period is that of the biblical Jacob. Though Jacob and his family were not a part of this foreign rulership as they remained in Egypt, as slaves after the Hyksos were expelled from the land. It should be noted that this Hyksos period was not a period of greatness in Egypt, though trade between the Hyksos capital of Avaris and the southern Levant persisted in abundance. A Heracleopolitan king explained that the arrival of the Hyksos came at a time of civil war in the land, when the security of the people was lacking. The Hyksos controlled territories from the Delta up to Hermopolis and Middle Egypt, though some within this region were also controlled by lesser Asiatic groups, making up the 16th dynasty, and by Egyptian vassals. They somewhat continued Egyptian administrative tactics, they used Egyptian writing, and even engaged Egyptians in their service. The Hyksos rather strongly Egyptianized themselves, probably in some sort of attempt to legitimize their authority. Ultimately, the Hyksos made Upper Egypt pay tribute to their power, an army, ships, and even foreign connections facilitating their expansion as marauding troops even more so destabilized the already destabilized regions. The outside connections held by the Hyksos included, of course, the Levant, where they came from, but also Cyprus, and even Crete, as evidenced by Hyksos artifacts discovered at Knossos. Interestingly, it was the Hyksos who introduced the horse and the chariot into Egypt, possibly as early as the Middle Kingdom, as well as the composite bow and vertical loom. And they began to blend together Canaanite worship with Egyptian, equating the god Set with the god Baal, as well as introducing the goddesses Astarte and Anat into Egypt, which are also Canaanite deities. During the 17th dynasty, Theban kings fought back against the Hyksos, some possibly even dying in battle. Under Seqenenre, Tau II, the Thebans pushed northward in an attempt to recapture Egypt. Now, although relations with the Hyksos were said to be good at the time, Seqenenre's successor, Kamose, continued the fight against the foreigners. Ultimately, it was Ahmose, successor of Kamose and founder of the 18th dynasty, who expelled the Hyksos from the lands and even followed them into the southern Levant, laying siege to a fortress there. The new kingdom begins with the expulsion of the Hyksos and the destruction of any residual power bases in the southern Levant that remained. The 18th dynasty reconquered and reestablished a unified kingdom, moving the capital back to Memphis. Surprisingly, for a time from so long ago, the period is actually pretty well documented. The new period of Egyptian history is one of an Egyptian empire, their power spreading, really for the first time, beyond historical Egypt. The Hyksos period forced the kings to adopt a rather aggressive foreign policy. And although not organized as an Egyptian province, the Egyptian kings held sovereignty over several Levantine city-states. They pushed deep into Nubia and reestablished old Middle Kingdom fortresses. And they reopened old trade routes, including into the rather remote land of Punt, or Punt, likely somewhere along the eastern Horn of Africa, where the typical goods were spices, resins, ivory, baboons, probably slaves, and more. The skills and techniques that the Hyksos utilized in war, concepts adapted from the north, were further adapted by the New Kingdom kings to lay the foundation of what would be the Egyptian empire of the New Kingdom. Now, though the 18th dynasty kings generally followed older kingship patterns, kingship itself went through an innovative stage. One aspect of this innovative stage was the increasing direct military leadership, establishing warrior kings upon the throne. Another military innovation was that of the war chariot. It was only after the Second and Intermediate period that the Egyptian army introduced chariotry for the use in war, another concept adapted from the Asiatics. As a matter of fact, before that point, wheeled vehicles generally didn't exist in Egypt. They just didn't have any use for them. The Nile River provided a better system of transportation. Innovations were also made in the realm of literature. While older genres of literature continued into this period, such as autobiographies, annals, and hymns, two new styles of poetry emerged: the love poem and the epic poem. Some examples of love poems include lyrics to be recited at banquets with dancing imagery, and others include invocations of Hathor, goddess of love, in order to secure a young man's perpetual love. Epic poetry, such as the Prayer of King Ramses II, records poetry in narrative form. In the Prayer of King Ramses II, the king recants his deeds as evidence that the deity, Amun, should supply help in the Battle of Kadesh, listing building projects, trade relations, and more. Of note, the Dynasty 18 rulers attributed much of their successes, including the expulsion of the Hyksos and military campaigns in the Levant, to the god Amun. Grave robbing had occurred throughout history, and most of the Old Kingdom pyramids were likely looted during the First Intermediate Period. Because of this, the burial of the kings had moved away from the huge pyramids, which, really, they were just giant billboards advertising the location of wealth, to what is known today as the Valley of the Kings. Now, the area was isolated, but near the capital, and the kings were buried in deep, rock-cut tombs. Later in the New Kingdom, to be accompanied nearby by deceased queens and princes. Of course, this isolated location did little to stop grave robbers, many of these tombs being opened and robbed during the 20th dynasty. As the Egyptian empire developed, an abundant commodity was introduced: the slave. Slavery in Egypt, though originating earlier, is seen in the capturing of prisoners of war who were enslaved dating back to the Old Kingdom. And slavery was well known to have occurred in the Middle Kingdom period. But with a growing international interest during the New Kingdom, large numbers of slaves were procured through warfare from both Nubia to the south and the southern Levant in the east. Of particular interest to this study, Canaanite slaves appear to have been used as a labor force in the turquoise and copper mines at Serbet el-Kadim in Sinai, who during the off-season likely resided in the delta. In fact, Egypt became quite exposed to Canaanite culture, language, and religion, not just from those enslaved, but also from free couriers and merchants. Should be noted that the presence of slaves, though understood, is underspecified in New Kingdom texts. The site of Tel el-Daba, or Esbet Helmi, was a site of a major naval base in the early New Kingdom, referred to as Peru Nefer, but referred to later in the history as Pyramese or Pyramses. Here, the presence of Canaanite cultic materials have been found, including iconography of the god Set Baal. This seaport was likely one of the two store cities, Ramses, that was built by the Hebrew slaves mentioned in Exodus 1:11. This site was quite important under Thutmose III and Amenhotep II during the 1400s BC, but there's a lack of records referring to this site again until a little later in history. The condition of slaves during this New Kingdom period is not very pleasant. Although not directly referred to as slaves, the satire of trades and early New Kingdom text praising the advantages of being a scribe lists several of the disadvantages of being a slave, including not benefiting from one's work and receiving 50 lashes for not being able to work. Toward the end of the 18th dynasty, Egypt entered something of a parenthetical period where a king, Akhenaten, sometimes referred to as the heretic king, established a new cult worshiping Aten, the sun disk deity. Now, this may have been a dismissal of the Egyptian pantheon in order to worship just one god, or a form of henotheism, where one god is worshipped above others, particularly as representations of Amun-Ra were destroyed or erased, but other deities didn't suffer the same fate. Either way, the king changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten in order to honor his deity, and later Egyptians, they really didn't like that. The king moved the capital to Amarna in Middle Egypt, and appears to have really been far too engrossed in the construction of the capital and his newly founded religion to care for international affairs. As evidence from the Amarna letters, a group of cuneiform communications sent to the king from the southern Levant, Akhenaten appears to have been indifferent to the fact that Egyptian control in the Levant was disintegrating. It's also possible that the lack of interest in the region was due to Hittite superiority, particularly as the Hittites had just recently defeated the Mitanni Empire, who were allied with Egypt. The kings of Egypt during this period had found it difficult to maintain the empire so far away. From Akhenaten onward, the 18th dynasty, it just lost its power. Ultimately, the 19th dynasty would restore that power, stabilizing the kingdom once again and ushering in the Ramesside period. Major shifts in Egyptian society occurred between the Old Kingdom and the 18th dynasty. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, the vizier dominated the central administration of the land. Under Thutmose III in the New Kingdom, the vizier's wide-ranging duties, including the regulation of the army, most likely a reaction to the previous Hyksos invasion. They got to have somebody ready at all times. He also was involved or directly led the administration of maritime forces and fortresses, and even control over the cutting down of trees. During the later periods of the 18th dynasty, the vizier appears to have had more control than the king himself. At the end of the 18th dynasty, the vizier of the boy king Tutankhamun became king. This would appear to make a major change in Egyptian royal succession, as during the 19th dynasty, the title appears to have become mandatory to legitimize kingship. Basically, the vizier was the guy who showed that he was capable of ruling the kingdom, and so became the next pharaoh. During the 19th and 20th dynasties, known as the Ramesside period in Egypt, once again faced a threat from foreign forces, including repelling a Libyan invasion. Hittite power also threatened Egypt until a treaty could be made. Later, the attempted invasion of the Sea Peoples and their subsequent invasion of the Levant diminished the Egyptian king's desire for expansion. That said, by the Ramesside period, the ideal of peace through victory included essential elements of loyal foreigners, Egypt becoming much more pluralistic at this time than any point previously. The end of the Ramesside period and the New Kingdom itself was marked by short reigns and political unrest. The influence of the 20th dynasty dying out with the death of the last king, Ramses XI. Upper Egypt began to revolt. The rebels pushed out the high priest of Amun, and villagers at Deir el-Medina went on strike. And they looted the tombs for precious goods. Ultimately, the Ramesside power over Egypt was lost, being replaced instead with a usurper as high priest. Eventually, Libyan immigrants in the north came to power over the Lower Kingdom, beginning the Third Intermediate Period. Now, I apologize if this lecture has gone a bit long, but I'm hoping that you're at least enjoying our trip through ancient Egypt. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me.